Welcome to Moments with Marianne. This is your host, Marianne Pestana. And we're here today with special guest, Dr. Fuchsia Sirois, who's here to share with us her new book, Procrastination: What it is, why it's a problem, and what you can do about it. So Dr. Fuchsia Sirois is a professor of social and health psychology at Durham University and a former Canada Research Chair in Health and Well-being. Her research focuses on understanding the psychological factors and qualities that confer risk or resilience for physical health and well-being outcomes through self-regulation and emotions. So welcome to the show, Dr. Fuchsia Sirois.
Thanks very much for having me, Marianne.
What an honor it is to have you here and to talk about this book. I saw this book and I knew immediately we needed to talk. I did not want to procrastinate. And I'm so glad that we did. What inspired you to even get interested in this topic?
That's a great question. I mean, I think about it, it's like I've been studying procrastination for over 20 years. So I did get into it when I was a graduate student back in Canada. And there was a researcher in the department, Tim Pitchell, who was like leading researcher on procrastination. And I was interested in health. And he showed me a study that showed that students who procrastinated had worse health. And I thought, oh, that's fascinating. Why would procrastination make you unhealthy? And that just sort of piqued my scientific interest. And yeah, here I am 20 plus years later, still trying to research and understand why people procrastinate and the impact it has on their health and well-being.
It seems to be a very hot topic. What is procrastination really?
A great place to start. I think a lot of people have misconceptions about what procrastination is. They often confuse it for sort of your garden variety, run-of-the-mill delay. And indeed, procrastination is a form of delay, but it's a particular form of delay. So as a researcher, I define it as voluntary and unnecessary delay of a task that you said you would do. So you formed an intention and said, I'm going to do this thing. I'm going to write this report. I'm going to clean the garage or whatever the task is. And yet you put off this task, or you put off starting it, or you don't complete it, despite knowing that there's going to be harmful consequences, either for yourself or others or both. So it's a form of harmful delay, basically in a nutshell.
So why do people procrastinate knowing all that?
Well, that is sort of the $1 million question. And different people have come at trying to answer that question from different perspectives. A few years back, myself and my colleague Tim Pitchell, who got me into this area of research, we looked at some of the existing studies that were out there. And, much of the research was like, oh, it's about poor time management, right? So we just give people time management courses, they'll procrastinate less. And others were saying, oh, it's just because people discount the value of the later, goals that they'll complete. And it's more, they put more value on, what they're doing right now and the distractions they're involved in. And we kind of felt very dissatisfied with those perspectives. And when we looked at the research, and especially this idea is like, why, if it's so harmful, why do people do it? We came to the conclusion that it is irrational. And if it is irrational, then emotions have to be involved. And so what we've found in the evidence and some of our research and other people's research is that basically when people are procrastinating, they're not procrastinating the task per se. They're not trying to get away from the task. They're trying to get away from the emotions that are linked to that task, specifically the negative emotions, because all the research shows that we put off tasks that we find unpleasant or aversive, not those that we find fun and exciting. So this is at the core of procrastination. It's about avoiding the negative emotions associated with a task that is either difficult or boring or stressful or anxiety-provoking or threatening to our self-esteem, or et cetera. So that's our perspective on why people procrastinate. It's all about emotions.
Well, that's so interesting. And we started this discussion talking about mental health and just health. So how does this affect our health and mental health?
Well, it has a profound effect, actually, much much greater than what most people realize. I think we tend to trivialize procrastination a lot. We see it as just something that everyone does. It's no big deal. You just won't get your work done, and that's the only consequence. And actually, decades of research now quite clearly show that people who regularly procrastinate, in particular, or frequently procrastinate, tend to have poor mental health. They have higher levels of stress, anxiety, and depression. They experience deep and profound guilt and shame when they procrastinate as well. They tend to ruminate a lot, engaged in sort of this negative self-directed thinking after they procrastinate. So it takes a huge toll on mental health. And then, of course, if emotions are involved in procrastination, then you start feeling worse about yourself and the task, and that just actually drives you to procrastinate more. So you can get into this really negative downward spiral of procrastination. So that's the mental health side. The physical health side is actually quite surprising, the impact it has. Some of it's not so surprising and some of it is. And so, yes, there's a lot of research that I've done and others have done that have shown quite clearly that people who procrastinate regularly experience higher levels of stress. And we know just how detrimental stress can be to our physical health. It takes a toll on our immune systems in the short run, can make us more susceptible to flus and colds and viruses. It can also lead to insomnia, muscle aches and strains, variety of short-term health problems. And also, if you're procrastinating, putting off unpleasant tasks, most people don't find changing their diet to healthier and less tastier food very enjoyable. So they're going to tend to put that off. Same thing with trying to become more physically active. So, and this is what I found in my research over the last 20 years, is that people who regularly procrastinate also put off those really important health promoting behaviors that would help support their health. So you have this combination of stress and poor health behaviors, and that can set certain individuals up to actually experience much more serious health issues in the long run, especially if the procrastination continues. In fact, in one study, I found that people who were prone to procrastination actually were at greater risk for having poor heart health in the form of higher risk for hypertension and cardiovascular disease. So that's not trivial anymore. That's now, especially if it's an ongoing issue, it can take a real toll on physical health and mental health too.
Oh, that's some big signs to pay attention to hear about that kind of effect it has on the human body. So if we have folks out there that are going, well, I just delay a little bit, I'm in that delay category, I really don't procrastinate, how can they determine whether or not that they are really, really in procrastination as opposed to slightly delaying?
Yeah, no, fantastic question. I think, the key thing, there's a lot of reasons why we might delay. And this is why we use that term unnecessary and voluntary delay as procrastination. So sometimes it might be necessary to delay starting something because you don't have enough information. And so that there's a fine line there, because as long as you're going out and then getting the information you need so that you can start the task, that would be considered sort of a wise or sagacious delay rather than procrastination. But if you say, okay, I've got this, report I have to write, for example, and I'm missing some information to start it, so I'm not going to start it at all. But then you don't actually follow through and go get the information you need. That would be procrastination, because now the delay is, you can't say that it's a necessary delay because you've actually put off now going to seek the information that would help you get started. So that's one way of looking at it. Is that delay necessary? Is there a good reason for that delay? The other is whether it's voluntary or not. And sometimes we have to put things aside because an emergency comes up, or it's, at the wishes of other people where they say, I need you to put this aside right now because there's something more important you need to attend to. So we need to, sometimes it's reprioritization of goals, especially at the request of other people, that might make us delay. And those delays might be reasonable or wise delays. When it's not at the request of somebody else, and it's you who've decided, I'm going to put this off, and there isn't a good reason to put that off. And somewhere at the back of your mind, you've got this kind of nagging feeling that, I don't feel like doing this right now, and I shouldn't be putting it off, but I am going to anyways. That's procrastination. And I think it is really about, we kind of almost trusting your gut in some ways, because that you shouldn't be putting it off, but you do. And that's usually a hint that you might be procrastinating.
It sounds like that can be quite a vicious cycle of procrastination, kind of feeling bad and down on yourself, more procrastination. It's like a little hamster wheel.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it turns into a very vicious cycle quite easily. And one of the reasons this happens too is that you've got to think about it. If you're putting aside that task because it, makes you feel insecure, you're worried about whether what you're going to do is going to be good enough for your boss or for your partner, and you've got all these fears and concerns and worries around that task, and you put it aside, you get an immediate sense of relief. So it's actually rewarding emotionally to procrastinate, right? You get to feel better now, but you do so at the cost of actually taking care of that important thing that you should be taking care of. And this is where it comes back to bite you, because a lot of the research has shown that, as I mentioned earlier, people who regularly procrastinate, they don't feel good about the procrastination. So they do tend to sort of engage in these very negative thoughts about themselves, like, what's wrong with me? Why can't I get started? Why do I always procrastinate? And so that relief that they get from putting the task aside, is very temporary. And in fact, they end up feeling worse in the end because of all the guilt and shame attached to procrastination.
In your book, you talk about self-regulating problems. How does that fit into this, and what does that mean?
With self-regulation, it's really just our ability to, manage and direct our thoughts and our emotions and our behaviors towards reaching a goal. And so, when we're procrastinating, we're not doing very well at self-regulation. We're actually failing at self-regulation quite miserably. And so that means then that we're not going to be reaching our goals. And this is another sort of one of the tolls of procrastination, is that, people who regularly procrastinate are, because they're not able to effectively self-regulate, manage those emotions that they have about a task and sort of get on task and do what they need to do to reach their goals. They don't reach their goals. They have unfulfilled dreams, that are sitting there. Oh, if only I had done this, but they didn't take action because they were nervous about the outcome or worried or what have you. And so it can sort of leave a real toll in terms of people being able to live a fulfilling life that way because of these self-regulation issues.
Now, are there triggers that cause us to procrastinate?
So this is, it's an interesting question, and one, I think, again, there's a lot of myths around procrastination here. So we often think that, if we have social media, that's going to trigger me to procrastinate, right? If I have, got my smartphone, or I've got, social temptations around me, people saying, hey, let's go have some fun when you've got work to do. We kind of think that that's the trigger for procrastination, but it's actually not. Those are things in the environment that make it easier to procrastinate, but they don't trigger the procrastination per se. What triggers the procrastination is your interaction with that task that you have to do, right? And this has a lot to do with how we view the task. So if we look at that task and we say, I don't feel confident enough that I can do this in a way that I think others expect me to, or doing this stresses me out, even thinking about this task stresses me out, right? Or, it's going to be too difficult or too frustrating or too challenging. We might imagine how difficult working on that task is going to be. It's those emotions that triggers procrastination. But if you're in an environment where there's a lot of digital distractions or social temptations, that's going to make it easier then to sort of, not necessarily sit down and grapple through those negative emotions, and instead find some other way of relief by disengaging from the task. So it gives you a reason to disengage from that task that you're emotionally struggling with. And it doesn't trigger the procrastination per se.
So it's that feeling of, I'm feeling good right now, things are okay right now, and so we'll just keep putting things off so I don't have to deal with it, and then we build the stress up.
Yeah, exactly. So if you put that task off, it'll give you an immediate relief, but then we know that task is still there. It doesn't go away. So the stress, remains and often builds up.
It's just there waiting for us.
Yeah, exactly. We'd like to think out of sight, out of mind, but yeah, it always comes back to bite us.
Yeah, it's kind of like that proverbial we're brushing everything under the rug, and before you know it, we've got a little mountain there.
Exactly.
Well, and you mentioned a little bit earlier about myths with procrastination. What are some of those?
Yeah, so I think one of the common ones is that procrastination is about poor time management. And it makes sense why we might believe this, because if we look at somebody who's procrastinating, what we see is they're not meeting their deadlines, right? They said they would do something by a certain time, or maybe they have an external deadline to deal with, but they're not making those deadlines, or they're leaving things to the last minute. And so it's easy to look at that person, on the very superficial level and say, well, they're not meeting their deadlines. Therefore, they're not managing their time well. So let's teach them how to manage their time well, and then they'll meet their deadlines. The problem with that approach is that it's not the poor time management, again, that's causing the procrastination. It's actually the emotions attached to that task, which people don't see, right? So we're often making judgments about the causes of procrastination just by looking superficially at what people look like when they're procrastinating. And a lot of the research on time management, it's equivocal at best. There's so many inconsistencies in it. And those studies that do show that people procrastinate less after time management, that procrastination is not sustained, right? So it's a bandage, sort of a quick fix, because that person's not managing their emotions, right, around that task, which is, again, that's sort of the core procrastination, poor mood management rather than poor time management. Next time they encounter a difficult task, it's their emotions that is going to drive the procrastination again, and they'll forget about anything they learned in terms of time management. So that's one of the more common myths. Another one has to do, we like to make, character judgments about people when we see them procrastinate. Again, we look at them and we say they're not being very productive. They're not getting their stuff done. And so one way to sort of, summarize that is to look at them and say, well, they're lazy then, right? Because they're not doing what they should be doing. So therefore they're lazy. We like to sort of attribute these character flaws. The difficulty with that particular view is that actually psychologically, when people feel lazy, they don't feel like doing anything at all. They have zero energy, just no motivation, no energy, nothing. And yet what you find is amongst people who very frequently and regularly procrastinate, they get very busy sometimes with non-essential tasks. So they're running around, organizing their desk or cleaning their home or doing all kinds of other very busy things that make them look and feel very productive that aren't the thing that they should be doing. So that kind of goes against this idea of laziness, again, as being sort of, a cause or a reason for procrastination. But yet again, it persists out there because we tend to look at superficial. We don't see what's going on with that individual. We don't see the stress or the anxiety or the worries or the concerns that they have about the task and the fact that they're struggling to manage those emotions.
I'm sure a lot of people are listening to this going, okay, well, I manage people and I've been calling, maybe I've been thinking of people in the wrong categories as lazy when they maybe need additional help.
Yeah, exactly. And this is the key thing. It's about, we all have to deal with difficult tasks, right? And we all might feel a little uncomfortable or stressed or worried or incompetent or uncertain. But most of us find a way to manage those emotions, and so we manage those emotions and we get on with the task. People that are prone to procrastination have a particular difficulty in managing those negative emotions. Either they weren't taught or modeled those skills growing up, or they may be also going through a time in their life where they've got so much else going on in the background that their coping resources for managing negative emotions are already stretched to their limit. So then when they have this unpleasant task, they just don't have anything left to deal with it. So they use procrastination to manage those emotions because it's quick and it's easy. And it doesn't take any extra resource, especially if they're really sort of stretched past their capacity.
Is it also typical that people just don't have, as you're kind of saying, like the resources and the tools in order to work through their procrastination?
Yeah, exactly. They don't have those tools to work through those negative emotions, those difficult emotions. They may never, really developed sort of effective emotion regulation skills. And so, we can think of procrastination as a way to regulate your emotions. It's not a very good one, though, because it doesn't, effective emotion regulation skills deal with the problem, once and for all. It doesn't come back, right? So you manage those emotions and then they don't come back to get you. But with procrastination, because you're just putting off managing those emotions, they come back and they often get amplified as well, too. It is, and what the research has shown in support of this too is that when you actually, there's been a couple of studies now that when they've given people, brief course in emotion regulation on how to manage their emotions, how to look at tasks that are difficult reappraise them in a different way, so that they're not as threatening. They find that when they follow up with them, that they actually procrastinate less. And some of the research I've conducted as well has shown exactly the same sort of thing, just sometimes getting people to reframe the task and not as difficult, but as maybe something that's meaningful to them actually will result in less time procrastinating.
Well, other than purchasing your book, Procrastination, what are some of the things that we can start doing that would change some of these behaviors?
Oh, great question. And I think, it depends on sort of where you're coming at from in terms on the spectrum of the emotions that you might be driving your potential procrastination. So, there's things you can think about in terms of structuring your tasks so that they don't become overwhelming in the first place and you don't want to procrastinate them. And one strategy, and you'll hear it a lot, and it is effective for a number of reasons, is to take, if you have a big task, that can feel really overwhelming and stressful. And we know if you feel stressed, you're going to be more likely to procrastinate it. So taking a big task and breaking it down into small, much more manageable nuggets or bite-sized goals and tasks is actually an effective strategy because it does a couple of things. First of all, it diffuses any feelings of stress that might come from seeing it as a huge thing that you have to do. And now it looks like something that's a little bit more manageable. And also, as you work through sort of the steps to, the smaller steps within that larger task, every time you complete one, you actually increase your confidence that you can continue and go on. So it gives you a sense of satisfaction and a sense of confidence in your ability, especially if you were nervous about whether this is something you could do or not. So yeah, structuring your tasks in a way so that they're not stressful is one way. And at the beginning too, say in a work-related environment, if you've got a task that you've never had to do before, something you're completely unfamiliar with, these are the types of tasks actually that people are more prone to procrastinate because something that's unfamiliar creates uncertainty. And when we feel uncertainty, we feel stressed, we feel anxious, and then we've got those emotions to deal with. And, so we're not sure what we're doing. So we're more likely to put those tasks off. So making sure that you've got the information that you need, if you have any questions, going to your manager or going to a coworker or somebody else and saying, what is it? I'm not sure if I'm doing this right. I'm not sure if this is what's needed. Not being afraid to ask those questions up front rather than just feeling stressed by them and putting it aside. That's sort of another way to sort of head off procrastination at the beginning. But if you do find yourself in a situation where you have started to procrastinate, the difficulty there is that it can easily, as we talked about earlier, spiral into sort of this negative cycle of procrastination because you start feeling worse about the procrastination. So then you're more likely to avoid the task because it reminds you that you're procrastinating and all those feelings and thoughts, that you might have towards yourself that are not very positive. So in those sorts of situations, it's really important to diffuse the negative emotions. And rather than being critical and judgmental of yourself, paradoxically, what the research shows is being forgiving and compassionate towards yourself will actually reduce the chances that you'll continue to procrastinate. And it sounds counterintuitive because we think if we forgive ourselves or if we're compassionate to ourselves, we're kind of giving ourselves a free pass for procrastinating. And in fact, that's not what the research shows at all. There's been studies with students where they found that those who were procrastinating on their schoolwork, and then they asked them how much they forgave themselves for that procrastination. Those who forgave themselves more actually went on to stay on target with their academic deadlines versus those who didn't forgive themselves. And with respect to compassion, or rather self-compassion, some of the research that I've done has shown quite clearly that, first off, people who frequently procrastinate tend to be not very compassionate towards themselves. They're very hard on themselves and very critical. But if you get people to think about their procrastination in a more compassionate way, in a kinder way, rather than a self-blaming way that sort of feeds into those negative self-critical thoughts and only dials up more and more of that negative emotion, that's enough to diffuse that negative emotion and actually has the added bonus of creating more motivation. So people who are self-compassionate are more motivated to improve themselves, and the research has shown that they get on with the things that they need to do. They reach their goals. They don't wallow in self-pity and these other negative thoughts. They just say, you know what, yeah, I'm not happy that I procrastinated, but I'm not going to beat myself up over it. Instead, I'm going to focus on doing better next time. So I'm going to get on with things.
That's a much kinder, gentler way to approach things as opposed to, oh my gosh, I didn't do this, so now I'm late, and then this kind of spiral of emotions.
Yeah, exactly. And again, it is counterintuitive, and it's also why we tend to be harsh on people who are procrastinators. And actually, that's the worst thing you can do. The best thing you can do is to be compassionate towards them and understand they're struggling emotionally, with this task for whatever reason. And, showing them some kindness can also help them maybe be a little bit more kind to themselves and sort of break that cycle of procrastination and just get on with what they need to do.
It seems that our society is so ingrained with perfectionism. So how does that play a role in us procrastinating?
Now, great question. I mean, yes, perfectionism is linked to procrastination, most definitely. And you're right too that we are in a society and a culture that is appears to anyways promote being perfect. And certainly, we've got social media and everything else now. Everyone's got perfect images. They're all airbrushed and all this, and we tend to think that that's reality, the sort of perfect vision of how people look and how they act and what they achieve. And it is a bit of an illusion there. There is, first of all, there's no such thing as perfection, but also we tend to mistake excellencism, which is striving to be your best, and striving for excellence, for perfection, and the two are quite different. But, going back to procrastination, perfectionism definitely plays into it. Some of the research that I've done, we did a study where we basically reviewed all the other research out there on the links between procrastination and perfectionism. And, perfectionism it's what we call multidimensional. There's different dimensions or facets of it. So there's a type of perfectionism where you're striving to reach your own standards, but still you can be a bit harsh on yourself and really push yourself too hard sometimes. And then there's another type of perfectionism we call perfectionistic concerns, where people are the ideals that they're striving for are the ones they think they should be striving for. So they're the ones they think their friends, family, parents, society, coworkers. They're basically thinking that this is how I should be. This is what other people want me to be. And so they're constantly thinking they have to live up to these unrealistic standards, or people won't like them or love them or accept them, etc. And so it's a very dysfunctional form of perfectionism. So in our research, we looked at how both of these forms of perfectionism might link to procrastination, like it's a general tendency to procrastinate, almost like a personality trait. And we had I think it was over 44 studies that include over 10,000 people. And what came out quite clearly was that the more dysfunctional type of perfectionism, that perfectionistic concerns that's driven by trying to meet other people's standards, was actually positively linked to a tendency to procrastinate, whereas the other form of perfectionism wasn't at all. And the idea here is that if you have that sort of perfectionism where you're trying to reach these other standards, and you really feel that your self-worth is contingent upon meeting these standards, you can imagine if you have a task that's difficult or unfamiliar, you're immediately going to be thinking, how can I do this perfectly? And if I don't do it perfectly, people won't accept me. And so you can get very stressed and very worried about that, especially if you even start the task and start encountering a little bit of difficulties. Someone who's a perfectionist is going to be more likely to go, right, I'm not doing it right. I'm not doing it well enough. It's never going to be good enough. And so they abandon the task and they procrastinate. And that's really how perfectionism comes into play and can promote procrastination. It's this expectation that everything should go smoothly when I'm working on a task, and that there's no room for flaws or errors or missteps or lapses or anything. which is, not realistic and certainly not how things happen in the real world when we're working towards reaching our goals. We always experience ups and downs and setbacks, but we eventually end up getting to where we need to be.
Well, I think for a lot of people, that's very encouraging to hear. A lot of times I think people like, oh my gosh, I took this squiggly line and I finally made it, as opposed to a straight line getting to where they're from point A to point B and they've arrived.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the straight line thing, that path is a myth. That doesn't happen. But that's what perfectionists expect. And this is why when they do experience those little ups and downs of the squiggly path that most of us take towards reaching our goals, they immediately read it as failure. And so they abandon what they're doing.
So if we are raised from a family that procrastinates, is that a learned behavior that we'll pick up as well?
That's a great question. This goes back to the whole nature-nurture debate in psychology more generally. I think it depends. So if you're looking just on the environment you're in, it can have two effects. You could see that that's just an acceptable way to do things, and just follow that same habit as, what your parents or other family members do, and just say, yeah, this is just how you do things. You put things off. But that's not necessarily always the case, too, because you can also have an opposite pattern where people might become hyper-punctual and organized because they see how stressed their family members are when they procrastinate. They see the difficulties they experience and they vow that I don't ever want to be like that. So you can certainly have, one of two different ways. Parental and family influence on procrastination, I think, is something that's not studied enough. There's only been a couple of studies looking at, for example, parenting styles and procrastination. And what they found is that, especially adolescent girls who procrastinated tended to have parents who were much harder on them, who expected a lot. So almost sort of feeding us that perfectionism. So rather than let the parent down or disappoint them, they just never went ahead and did the task in the first place and procrastinated. So, there can be a dynamic too with the parenting style, not just sort of whether the family members or parents are procrastinators. But that being said, that's sort of the nurture side of things. There's actually other research that shows that at a genetic level, there's actually a high degree of heritability for a tendency to procrastinate. It's something like 46%. And now that's not, at the gene level, but it's suggesting when they've looked at twins raised together and raised apart, and tendencies to procrastinate, there actually does appear to be a strong genetic underpinning. And I think this makes some sense too, because it has to do with people's tolerance for negative emotions, as well as maybe more of a natural sort of natural or ingrained tendency to be able to manage emotions well or not. I'm not saying we can't learn emotion regulation skills, but some people are just more naturally take to that than others. And so that might be underpinned by, a variety of different genetic factors as well.
I was real impressed within your book. You share these questions, becoming aware of how your beliefs shape your feelings. And it's a thing that I don't think a lot of people ever think about or investigate.
No, and it's not something we often, delve down into. And those questions were taken from, standard sort of cognitive behavioral therapy approaches, which really get us to, question the beliefs that we have. We often have beliefs about ourselves and about the world. So we might believe that we're not deserving of certain things, or we might believe that this is the only way I can manage my emotions, or we might believe that I can't change my emotional states at all. Or beliefs about, our confidence or our esteem and being able to finish tasks. And we think of those as just being a reality, just that's how it is. And so sitting down and actually questioning these and trying to probe them a little bit more and just say, that is actually a belief first and foremost, recognizing that it's a belief, it's not a fact. And then trying to understand where it came from can be really important, I think, especially for people who really struggle with procrastination and where these sorts of beliefs constantly come into play, especially when they evaluate a task and their own ability to be able to complete it.
Well, I think that that's a pretty powerful thing. You've got so many, just such great information and resources within your book. When you were doing your research, is there anything that you discovered that most people would be very surprised at?
I think, most of my own research is in the area of, the health and well-being aspects. And I think I came across one study. So I was, at the chapter that focused on, the impact of procrastination on people's reaching their goals and fulfilling their dreams. And when I started to look a little bit more closer, not just at, how frequently people procrastinate at work and some of the costs that has to employers, but also the costs it has to the employee or the worker who procrastinates. There was one study that I was actually quite surprised about it because it showed, and this was over a large sample, it was 22,000 employees in the US. And what they found was that people who frequently procrastinated tend to have greater job insecurity, meaning that they moved from job to job. They couldn't keep a stable job down. And they also had lower annual incomes. So they're just not making as much money, probably because they're moving from job to job. And in fact, it worked out to something, if you looked at the measures that we use to assess people's procrastination levels on more of a personality trait or chronic level, for every 1 point increase in mean levels of chronic procrastination, annual income fell by 15,000 US dollars. So that to me was like, wow, okay, this is not trivial again here. The people who struggle with procrastination is having a huge impact on their career trajectories and their the capacity to fulfill their dreams, especially in the work and career area.
Yeah, that's very significant. My goodness. Is it that we're just not learning the life skills in this generation and other generations maybe were better? What are your thoughts on that?
In terms of the skills to not get into procrastination in the first place.
Yes.
Yeah, I think emotion regulation skills. I think it's a strange thing. I mean, there's been more and more focus and research on emotion regulation skills and how important they are. Whereas, you go back a few decades and, it wasn't really sort of on people's radar. Just because we have awareness of something, I don't know necessarily, again, whether that's something that means that we're procrastinating more now than we were a couple of decades ago. It just means we're more aware, I think, of the impacts of procrastination. And it may be, too, that people just kind of without any formal training or skills, you go back several generations, people had somewhat harder lives than what we do now. So they had a lot of difficult things they had to deal with. And basically you had to just kind of get on with them. So you found a way to get on with these difficult tasks, even if they were going to be stressful or unpleasant or whatever. And so maybe because of that, people did just naturally develop these emotion regulation skills. Whereas now, as life gets easier, it also means that when we encounter difficulties, we might be less well equipped to deal with those difficulties on an emotional level. And that may be one of the factors that feeds into procrastination. But again, we don't have, a lot of research comparing, rates and levels of procrastination, especially chronic procrastination, in current day to what they were, several decades before. First of all, because we've only really been studying chronic procrastination since the 80s. But even since then, for the last 40 years or so, I would venture a guess that rates have probably gone up.
Well, it's just interesting to know. I was just curious about that. And you're right. I mean, when we look back, even in the 60s and 70s, they really weren't talking about mental health back then. So, if they did, you probably were in a padded room, So.
Yeah, exactly. And so that left a lot of people with their own devices just to figure out what to do, right? It's sort of paradoxical in a sense. The more we talk about it, the more aware we become of the issues. And hopefully we would expect that there's help. But I think there's also more stigma around it that's out in the open too. When people are struggling with things, especially with their emotions. So, yeah, it's an interesting area to sort of think historically how we've managed things, difficult things back then versus now. And, for some people, procrastination becomes a way for them to manage those emotions, unfortunately.
And it's been a way of life. So nice and just exciting to have this type of information and research out there where people can be a part of their own, in many ways, of their own self-healing.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a key thing with the procrastination too, is it is about being aware. Not denying when you're struggling and have these negative emotions, just not trying to escape them by putting aside the task that sort of triggers them. But being able to sit with them and just work through them and accept them. And I think, that is one thing that has happened in recent years, is there more of a focus on mindfulness and accepting and just being with difficult emotions, although that can be quite hard for some people. But, we recently published a paper that showed that for students who are procrastinating, those who engaged with a mindfulness, more mindful about their emotions, they actually, when they followed up with them, procrastinated less. So I think there's, again, a lot to be said for just bringing awareness to the fact that there are these negative emotions that we might have, and where they can lead in terms of procrastination and not being able to get our goals completed.
In your book, you have this whole chapter on the power of reframing. So how does that play a part in all this?
So this goes back to this idea of how, the interaction that we have with the task. So when I say procrastination starts with an aversive or unpleasant task, well, who says whether a task is unpleasant or aversive, right? Like something that's aversive for you may be pleasant for me and vice versa. And so it all has to do with our perspective that we take on the task. And so reframing the task in different ways can be really important, especially if you're looking at a task in a way that is evoking some stress or anxiety or feelings of insecurity and making you want to procrastinate. So if we reframe things with respect to the task, for example, that's one way to potentially reduce the chances that you're going to procrastinate on it. And as I mentioned earlier, so some of the research we've done is looking at meaningfulness. So taking that task you're struggling with and asking yourself, why is this task meaningful to me? Or what we did in our studies, we got people to complete sort of a sentence. This task is meaningful because this task is important to other people because. And just helping people see the bigger picture of some of the things that they might be struggling with. And what our research has shown is that doing so, reframing it that way, rather than as a difficult task, but now as a meaningful task, actually reduces the negative feelings that people have about that task, which, as we know, are one of the things that fuel procrastination. But it also gives context to those negative feelings. Now, it might be okay to withstand a little bit of discomfort and anxiety because it's for a purpose. It's for something bigger that's meaningful to you. And our research, when we've got people to do that versus, not reframe in that way, has shown quite clearly that they do go on to procrastinate less on those tasks.
For people, sometimes I think getting into action could be difficult. Is there any type of way they can prepare to get into action and so that they're procrastinating less?
Yeah, and there's a fine line here with this, because you can spend a lot of time preparing for a task and as a way of procrastinating it. So I think, to take action, there are some things, and I know in the final chapter in the book, I talk a lot about this, just preparing yourself and getting ready. So there are a few things. One we've talked about already is making sure the task is structured in a way that feels manageable to you. Making sure that any uncertainties that you have about the task, especially if it's a new task or something you've not had to do before, that you've asked some questions, that you've got all the information that's necessary. And then if you are someone who is prone to procrastination, you might want to sort of procrastination proof your environment a little bit. In other words, make sure that your environment is not set up in a way that'll make it easy for you to disengage from the task if it gets difficult or challenging while you're working on it. So, removing digital distractions, for example. More and more people are working remotely now. So if you do have a home office, putting that do not disturb sign on the door so people don't just jump in, and make it easy for you to just disengage from what you're doing, especially if you're struggling with it. And then before you know it, the day's over and you've procrastinated. So setting up that environment. You can also set up your environment to remind you of the meaningfulness of tasks too. Especially if it's something that you anticipate is going to be difficult to do. You can do this to a certain point, but as I said, you have to be careful with this too, because you can spend a lot of time setting up your environment, but not actually start getting started on things. So it's a balance between, reducing anything that might create or bring into the forefront these negative emotions that are going to, might make it more difficult to stay on task. But in the end, especially if you're a perfectionist, you have to kind of just say the perfect time to start is now, right? You don't want to get too carried away trying to set up the perfect environment and have the task all structured so that you actually never spend time doing it. At some point, you do just have to take action and just take that first step. And one of the things that's nice about that is just taking action sets a momentum. It actually gets you going in the direction towards your task. And that can feel good. And it can be, reaffirming that, yes, you can do this task. You can get it done, especially if you're having doubts about your ability to complete it.
Now, as far as perfectionism goes, is that something we should become a reforming perfectionist, or is that helpful at all?
Yeah, I think you have to kind of shelve the perfectionism a bit if you want to deal with your procrastination, because perfectionists will always find a reason why it's not the right time to start. It's like, oh, I'm not comfortable enough, or it's not the right time of day, or I don't have enough, creativity today, or I'm too tired, or you'll go looking for excuses, and you won't have that perfect time. And this is an illusion again, right? We think that we're going to do our best work and the task is going to go smoothly if we start under the perfect circumstances and the perfect environment. And there is no such thing, right? The perfect time is the time that you start, period, right? Whenever that is, wherever that is, whatever the circumstances of your environment. And so some of the things I've said about setting up your environment to help you are, again, for people who are particularly prone to procrastination, but you don't want to get so caught up in that preparation that you lose sight of the fact that you're doing this preparation instead of spending that energy actually getting started with the task.
What do you want our listeners to take away from your book?
I think one of the key messages, and I sort of hope that it was sort of woven through the pages there, was that we need to understand that procrastination is something that we all do, and we need to be more compassionate, both to ourselves and others, right? Because negative emotions are really the driving force behind procrastination. Anything that we do that feeds into those negative emotions is only going to make things worse. So we need to be more compassionate. We need to be gentler with ourselves and with others when they're procrastinating, and understand that underneath what looks like laziness or poor time management or defiance or however else we might be characterizing somebody who's not doing that thing that we want them to doing, even if it's ourselves, right, is an emotional struggle. Right? And for some people, that emotional struggle, it runs deep, and they may need, more professional help to deal with the underlying issues. But for many of us, it is just recognizing that, sometimes things are difficult and they're stressful, but there's also great value in working through those feelings and accomplishing our goals and feeling good about ourselves and taking pride in the fact that we are taking action. So just, being kinder and more compassionate to ourselves and others when we procrastinate, that's really the key to addressing this issue.
Where can our listeners connect with you and be part of your community and learn more about your work?
Great question. So, I'm an academic. I'm obviously don't necessarily have a website set up just yet, but there's a few things that will be coming soon. I obviously have a presence on Twitter, but I've also will be starting a blog on Psychology Today. And the blog is titled Perspective Matters. And so I'll be writing some short articles. Some of these will be about procrastination, some will be about perfectionism, some will be about self-compassion. Really just sort of the blog is meant to sort of highlight, the role of perspective in our, physical and mental health and well-being. And it really has to do with how we see things and ourselves and our worlds that can make such a huge difference in our well-being. So I'll be highlighting some of the research in my blog posts that demonstrates that.
Well, Fuchsia, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
And thanks very much for your kind invitation to join you, Marianne.
Well, thank you, Professor Sirois. It has been such an honor to spend this time with you and to talk about your new book, Procrastination, what it is, why it's a problem, and what you can do about it. Procrastination's available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all indie retailers. And if you don't see it on the shelf, ask for them to order it. We're going to pause here for a quick moment, and we'll be right back after this message. I'd like to thank Jason Eastwood at Guitarfulness for sharing his inspiring music and talent with us. His music is known worldwide for cultivating atmospheres of harmony, inner peace, and clarity. Visit Jason's website at guitarfulness.com. Join his newsletter, be part of his community, and download his music. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne, where we make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.